In this subunit, we will discuss the UCC approach to indefiniteness. Let's talk about the UCC approach to indefiniteness. Just to refresh our memories, to have a legally enforceable contract, a valid contract, we must have three things. We must have mutual assent. We've already talked about that. We must have consideration. We'll talk about that in Unit 5. And the terms, the material terms of the contract must be reasonably certain. All right, so now let's talk about the UCC approach. Imagine that we have a sale of goods and we have some sort of indefinite material term. Well, the UCC actually has gap fillers. The UCC is very liberal in its approach. It will supply the terms for the parties in many instances when the parties have either failed to agree on a material term, are vague as to a material term, or have agreed to later agree on a material term. There's probably one term that the court will not supply, and that is quantity. If the parties are vague as to the quantity, if the parties are silent as to quantity, or if the parties agree to later agree on quantity, the contract is probably not enforceable. All right, we said the UCC has gap fillers. It will fill gaps when the parties' contract is indefinite with respect to material terms. So let's talk about the specific and express instances where the UCC will fill those gaps. So the first one is where the parties left the price term open. Under that, the UCC says that a judge can supply a reasonable price. All right, the second instance is where the parties agree on a price and they fail to agree on a price. Once again, the UCC says the judge can supply a reasonable price. The next one is a little bit different. So imagine we enter into a contract for the sale and purchase of oil. And let's say it's a long-term contract. And we're trying to set the prices. We don't know what the price of oil is going to be in 5 years. So instead of trying to set the prices for 5 years in the future, we create a formula. And our formula is based on a standard. Let's say a standard that you can find in a trade publication. Let's assume there's a trade publication that publishes the average price of oil in a specific region during the year or during the month or whatever. And we say our formula is going to be based on that standard. Well, what if that publication ceases and we no longer have access to the standard? Well, in that case, the UCC treats it like an open price, and the court can supply a reasonable price. What if we don't agree to the delivery time? I order goods from you and we don't say when the delivery time should be. You guessed it, it's within a reasonable time. What if we have an open payment term? So I order goods from you and you agree to sell these goods to me, but we never say when I will pay you. Well, you might think that the answer is that I have to pay you within a reasonable time. That's not the answer. The UCC fills the gap and says, I must pay you upon delivery. What if we have an open place of delivery? What if I say, I'm going to buy goods from you, and you say, okay, I will sell goods to you, but we never say where we're going to deliver the goods, where you're going to deliver the goods. The standard under the UCC is that if parties haven't agreed to a place of delivery, the place of delivery is the seller's place of business. Generally, the UCC empowers judges to supply the material terms when the parties have been indefinite with respect to the material terms. In other words, the UCC decides that we should err on the side of enforcing the contract so as not to frustrate the intentions of the parties to be legally bound. All right, imagine a contract for the sale of goods is silent with respect to quantity. or the parties agree to later agree on a quantity, or the parties are vague as to quantity, what is the UCC approach? Well, let's just look at a quick example. Imagine that we have a contract between buyer and seller for Model X widgets at $50 each, but the parties never agreed to a quantity. How can the court enforce that contract? Well, the UCC is actually silent on the matter. It doesn't say so, but most courts and commentators and legal scholars say that this contract is unenforceable. So if the contract is indefinite with respect to quantity, under the UCC, this contract is not enforceable. Now, there are specific situations where the parties do not agree to a specific quantity, but under the UCC, these contracts will still be enforceable. And that's when we have an output contract or a requirements contract. And that's what we're going to discuss next. All right, first, let's look at what output contracts are. An output contract is where the quantity of the contract is based on seller's production. So it looks like this. Buyer says, I promise to buy all the widgets that you produce. And the seller says, I promise to sell you all the widgets that we produce. This is an output contract. Under the UCC, this contract is indeed enforceable. All right, now let's look at the requirements contract, right? The requirements contract is a contract where the quantity is based on the buyer's needs, the buyer's requirements. Buyer says, I promise to buy all the widgets I need from you, all the widgets I require from you. And the seller says, I promise to sell all the widgets that you need. I promise to sell to you all the widgets that you need, all the widgets that you require. Once again, a requirements contract is indeed an enforceable contract under the UCC. Let's take a quick look at UCC 2-306. This is where the UCC addresses output and requirements contracts. All right, a term which measures the quantity by the output of the seller, that is the output contract. Or the requirements of the buyer, that is the requirements contract. Now, the UCC puts some limitations on the discretion of the parties in the output and requirements contract. They say, the UCC provides that it means such actual output or requirements as may occur in good faith, right? So you can't produce, if you're a seller, you can't produce more than an amount that is in good faith. And if you are a buyer, you cannot require more goods than is in good faith. Do you remember the definition of good faith? Right? Good faith under the UCC has a subjective element. Can you spot it? That's right. Honesty in fact. Were you honest about your requirements? Were you honest about your output? There's also an objective element to good faith under the UCC. Can you spot it? Right. Observance of reasonable commercial standards of fair dealing. Were you reasonable in your output? Were you reasonable in your requirements? All right, but that's not the only limit on output and requirements contracts under the UCC. Let's look at the further limitations. All right, it says no quantity unreasonably disproportionate to any stated estimate. So when the parties enter into the output or the requirement contract, they may have stated an estimate. Right? Any output or requirement that the parties actually have under the contract cannot be unreasonably disproportionate to that stated estimate. What if they didn't state an estimate when they entered into the contract? Well, absence of a stated estimate, it cannot be unreasonably disproportionate to any normal or otherwise comparable prior output or requirements. In other words, if we don't have a stated estimate when we enter into the output or requirements contract, we will look at past dealings between the parties. And any output or requirement cannot be unreasonably disproportionate to what we had in past dealings.